our nation's conception of who drug users and dealers are. And law enforcement efforts became targeted on poor communities of color in the drug war. And drug law enforcement agencies, state and local law enforcement task forces committed to drug law enforcement have been rewarded for drastically increasing the volume of drug arrests. Federal funding flows to state and local law enforcement that boosts the volume of drug arrests, the sheer numbers. Many people think the drug war, has been targeted at violent offenders or aimed at rooting out drug kingpins. But nothing could be further from the truth. Local and state law enforcement agencies get rewarded for the sheer numbers of drug arrests, and federal drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement officials to keep 80% of the cash, cars, homes that they seize from suspected drug offenders, granting to law enforcement a direct monetary interest in the profitability and longevity in the drug war. And the results have been predictable. Millions of poor people of color have been rounded up for relatively minor nonviolent drug offenses. In fact, in 2005, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for possession. Only 1 out of 5 were for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And during the 1990s, the period of the greatest expansion of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug now widely believed to be less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and at least as prevalent in middle-class and suburban white communities as it is in the ghetto.
Michelle Alexander.
President Clinton.
Yes, I just wanted to bring it up to President Obama because this piece you wrote very interesting at TomDispatch.com called The Age of Obama as Racial Nightmare. Explain.
Yes, well, today, people around the globe, people of color in particular, have been celebrating the election of Barack Obama as kind of our nation's triumph over race and the history of racial caste in America. Yet the appearance of racial equality, the superficial appearance of racial equality that Barack Obama's election has afforded, serves to mask a deeply disturbing underlying racial reality, which is that large segments, a majority of African American men in some urban areas are either under the control of the criminal justice system or branded felons for life, locked in a permanent second-class status. This vast new racial undercaste, and I say caste, not class, because this is a population which is locked into an inferior status by law and by policy. This vast population has been rendered largely invisible through affirmative action and the appearance of success, with a handful of African Americans doing well in universities and corporations, the sprinkling of people of color through elite institutions in the United States due to affirmative action policies and the limited progress of turn 18. Their backpacks are searched, they're frisked on their way to school, while standing waiting for the school bus to arrive. Once they learn to drive, their cars are searched, often dismantled in a search for drugs. The drug war waged in these poor communities of color has created branded felons and relegated to a permanent second-class status for life. And the reason for their excommunication
I want to listen to their distorted views of the way they look at things. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna play you some audio with Bill O'Reilly and David Duke, the former leader of the KKK. We have that too as well. But let's listen to this debate and the disparity in opinions about racism and the justice system. Let's listen to this.
Well, Matt, many in this country are angry with the Attorney General Eric Holder for standing up at a convention and telling the truth. He said that there's a
Oh, well, that's Fox. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're trying to bring you this debate between these two panelists, and the screen just went blank on us, and these things do happen. Let's see if we can bring you this other one here. Okay, let's listen to the Bill O'Reilly. He got into a heated argument with former KKK leader David Duke. Let's see if we can bring you that one.
Follow-up segment tonight, Congress.
Yeah, it's Bill O'Reilly and David Duke. Coming to you real soon. As soon as we can get that up. I wish I had control over these things, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, I don't have control over that. But anyway, let's get back to that one. We get right back to that one. Okay? Now, there was a movie or a documentary called Slavery by Another Name. It relays the forgotten stories of the post-Civil War slavery. And I'm hoping that that one is able to play. Let's see if we can take a listen.
Now, a history of forced labor after the Civil War. A new documentary that airs tonight on PBS tells the story of how American citizens, freed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, remained under lock and key for decades afterward. Slavery by Another Name, based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book of the same name, tells the story of the thousands of African Americans who were arrested on trumped-up charges and forced to work as convict labor. In many cases, they were sent to the South's coal mines, including some owned by businessman and former slave owner John Milner. Historians and actors describe it in this excerpt.
After emancipation, industrialists replaced slaves with convicts, acquiring thousands from state and county governments.
You can't drive free labor the same way that you can force prisoners to mine 5 tons of coal a day. And this is why people like Milner wanted prisoners in his coal mines. He saw them as a great source of profit, and he didn't have to worry about labor disputes.
We would leave the cells around 3 o'clock a.m. and return at 8 o'clock p.m., going the distance of 3 miles through rain or snow.
To describe the conditions in a coal mine at this time, to say that they're primitive, is you can't even imagine it.
This is a place where, for weeks or months at a time, men might never see daylight. The mine was often filled with standing water around their ankles and their feet. They had to drink from that water. Disease ran rampant through these mines.
They were incredibly dangerous places to work, being subjected to violent explosions, poisonous gases that were released as coal fell from the walls. In addition to the falling coal itself,
whippings, keeping people chained up, brutal kinds of physical torture, and mental abuse are the norm. A lot of the things that kept people in control under slavery are amplified under this convict system.
Douglas Blackman is author of the book Slavery by Another Name and co-executive producer of tonight's film. A former reporter for the Wall Street Journal, he's now the chair of the Miller Center Forum at the University of Virginia. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You make the argument that slavery didn't end in 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, not in 1865 when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, but 1942.
Slavery didn't end when we all have been taught that it did. It receded for a time, and in the first years after the Civil War, African Americans, the formerly enslaved African Americans, did experience a period of authentic freedom and citizenship. But beginning 20, 25 years, depending on the place, after the Civil War, a whole new regime of involuntary servitude began to be put in place all across the South, and hundreds of thousands of people were catastrophically affected.
Why didn't we know these stories?
Well, we did know it at the time. Americans were very aware of it. Certainly white Southerners were, and by the beginning of the 20th century, whites all over the country had seen stories written about some of the, particularly the worst atrocities and some of the brutalities. But the truth is that by the early 20th century, most of America didn't really care anymore. The country had been fighting over the role of African Americans for almost a generation at that point. They were worn out with the political fight, and by the early 20th century, the North had largely decided to let the South do what it wanted to with black people.
So to help us understand how this could happen, tell us the story of, there's one person you mentioned in the documentary, Green Cottonham. Tell us his story.
Green Cottonham was the son of two former slaves in Alabama. He was born in freedom. He experienced some of some of that period of time in which you had huge numbers of black people who voted. Some were elected to office. They had a certain amount of economic freedom. They were largely still impoverished, but authentic freedom, separating themselves from the white families that had controlled their lives. But by the time Green Cottonham grew to adulthood in the first years of the 20th century, this whole new regime of laws had been put in place that essentially turned the American justice system on its head, and it became an instrument of injustice instead of a system of justice. And there were rafts of laws that effectively criminalized black life. It was almost impossible for a black man in the South, in the rural South, in the early 20th century, not to be at risk of arrest at almost any time, and the consequences of even the most trivial offenses were enormous. And
well, you make an interesting point in the book and in the documentary that economically it made more sense to protect slaves than it did to protect the lives of people who were convict laborers or people who were under peonage, it was called?
Peonage, which is a slavery, where a person is held against their will to work off an alleged debt to a landowner or to someone who has purchased them, essentially, and that's the language that was used, buying and selling. Someone who's been purchased from a county jail or purchased from a state prison system, and that's what had happened to Green Cottonham. He was arrested on a charge of vagrancy. He couldn't prove that he had a job in 1908. He couldn't pay the enormous fines. It was essentially 2 years' labor was the fine for vagrancy. He was immediately sold to a coal mine on the outskirts of Birmingham to a company that was then going to pay his fines off 1 month at a time. But instead, 5 months later, he died under horrible conditions in a coal mine outside of Birmingham owned by U.S. Steel Corporation.
And there are long-term consequences for these practices, which over the years have linked criminality and race.
This is how our country got in the habit.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's buffering. Uncontrollable things happen, and you just can't control these things, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to Doug Blackman, the co-executive producer of Slavery by Another Name, and he's just talking about the post-Civil War slavery. You didn't know that we still had slavery, right? Post-Civil War slavery. Yeah, slavery continued. Many of us thought that slavery was abolished, but we had what's called the post-Civil War slavery. Time check. The time is approximately 9:01 p.m. That time check is brought to you by Semper Alexander Computer Consultants, where they implement cost-effective solutions to fulfill your business.